Minnesota Gardening Podcast. It is my absolute honor to have you here with us today. We are talking about emerald ash borer, and as you drive around the metro, I drove to Iowa a couple weekends ago, dead trees are everywhere. So as you'll hear in the podcast, we've had 2 previous summers of just really terrible, hot, dry, stressful summers on our trees. And emerald ash borer is an insect that is attacking trees throughout the upper Midwest, and it's really important that people learn about them and what to do about them. So as you drive around, you see dead trees, there's a 9 out of 10 chance it's an ash tree that has been killed by emerald ash borer. So as we go forward here, we have Emma Schultz from the Minnesota DNR here with us today to help teach you and learn about emerald ash borer and what you need to know and how we can move forward with this together. There's no fixing it. There's no doing anything with it to help prevent it really at this point. It's just happening throughout most of the state and we have to deal with it. So this is our uplifting podcast episode with Emma Schultz of the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. Enjoy. All right. Welcome everyone to the Minnesota Gardening Podcast. Today we have an awesome guest talking about a really, really important topic that we all need to pay attention to throughout the upper Midwest and here in Minneapolis and the Twin Cities region where I live. It is just a horrific epidemic happening right now. And I've never seen it look quite like it does this year. And so we're talking about emerald ash borer, and it does seem tons and tons of dead trees around the metro. And we have Emma Schultz from the DNR here to help us understand what's going on and what we need to be doing about it as landowners, as homeowners, and just all throughout the state and upper Midwest as to what we can and should do. So Emma, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So Emma, could you introduce yourself a little bit and what your background is with regard to forestry and EAB and what you are currently doing?
Sure, definitely. I come from a forest management background, and currently I am the Community Forest Project Specialist at the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. I work in the small but mighty urban and community forestry team. And I help communities across Minnesota in a variety of ways through both technical and financial assistance. I facilitate a growing number of grants to communities statewide to help them prepare and manage for issues just like emerald ash borer. And then I also oversee the Tree City USA programs for Minnesota, and these are voluntary certification programs that recognize communities, campuses, and utilities for actively managing their trees. And you're right, EAB is really spreading across the metro, becoming prevalent, and becoming an eyesore, and is being noticed by people who have not noticed it in the past.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about that. So folks, we've seen it creeping up a little bit over the last 5-10 years in Minnesota, and is the complete devastation that we see right now. There's a client next to a client that I have. The other day I saw that every single tree in the parking lot and parking islands was probably 25-30 ash trees that were not noticeably not thriving last year are just completely dead this year. So what are we seeing that's different, and why is it all happening right now?
Yeah, sure. So EAB arrived in Minnesota in 2009, and since then it has been spreading across the state. There are now 40 counties across Minnesota with known emerald ash borer infestations. This ranges from the southeast corner of the state, almost all the way west to South Dakota, up through the Twin Cities and over past St. Cloud. And then there are additional outlying infestations in Fargo and the Duluth, Cloquet-Two Harbors areas. Add to that we are entering our third... What's that?
No, I was just going to ask a question, but keep going. You're entering our third?
I'm running on. We are entering a third season of drought here in the metro and beyond statewide. And so we are seeing that the quick deaths that can result from emerald ash borer are being exacerbated by that drought. And when you mention the common observance of large numbers of ash trees dying, in some communities, ash trees account for over 40% or even 50% of the trees. And just to get into a little bit of backstory on that, when elm trees were lost in great numbers to Dutch elm disease in the 1970s and 1980s, there was a move to replant with great numbers of ash. Ash couldn't quite compare to the stately vase shape of elm trees, but mature ash are still really beautiful and they provide fantastic canopy. And so up until the arrival of EAB, they were a perfect urban tree. And I think it's great that cities were able to budget for replanting following that devastation of Dutch elm disease. And clearly residents have benefited from the many benefits of mature ash canopies for a number of years. That these trees were planted in such great quantities, though, often monocultures or near monocultures in some cities, was a big mistake. And it's a mistake that should have been anticipated given why they were planted in the first place. But, it's easy to look back and make accusations or place blame, but I wasn't there then facing that unique suite of challenges, right? So all we can really do now is try to learn from that mistake and diversify our community trees going forward. And if we can do this, we, as the residents of Minnesota, we, as the neighborhoods and communities, will hopefully not be burdened with an overpopulated component of trees in the future like we are now with ash. So when emerald ash borer infests a community so heavily laden with ash trees, it really does become difficult to effectively control it. The population of beetles can skyrocket very quickly, and they can't easily be eliminated, especially if and when a management response is lacking or lagging. So that's a very long explanation for what you're seeing, and a lot of people are seeing around the Twin Cities metro and beyond.
Yeah, for sure. So let's kind of take this in backward order a little bit and talk about what, instead of talking about like exactly how EAB works and what's going on there, we'll get to that a little bit later. But let's talk about what people should be doing. So you mentioned diversifying trees as ash trees are dying. What does that mean, and how do people know and understand what to do with that?
Sure. So in terms of first identifying that they have emerald ash borer, is that what you mean?
Well, let's say that after the trees have died, what should they be doing? What happens next for removal and for replacing, hopefully, trees? Because it's really important that we have those trees replaced for, especially in our urban areas and suburban areas, for that tree canopy to be maintained. So what people should replace them with. So what do they do if they see the tree dying?
Okay, yeah, sure. So first off, if you have ash trees on your property, I highly recommend that you make a budget for their management. Do you value the shade that the canopy gives your home in the summer? Are there other benefits they bring to you in your yard, like minimizing stormwater runoff or absorbing pollutants? Or maybe you have some extensive perennial shade gardens that you want to maintain. So if you find yourself saying yes to any of these and you would like to keep your tree on the landscape alive, you will need to budget to chemically treat your tree every 2 to 3 years, well into the future, to keep it healthy and preserve it. This is if your tree is healthy enough to treat. So let me take a step back and acknowledge that there are inherent hazards in applying pesticides, but most potential hazards are mitigated when the work is done by certified pesticide applicators who are following best management practices. There's several chemical insecticides that are available for treating ash trees, but the only one that the DNR's Urban and Community Forestry team recommends is injectable emamectin benzoate. So injection of systemic insecticides to control EAB, it minimizes the impacts on non-target pollinators and other insects, and it eliminates the potential for spray drift. It can also provide more effective control than other chemicals like imidacloprid or dinotephrine, and it provides control for longer, 2 or 3 years versus 1. And then most importantly, perhaps, unlike these other treatments, emamectin benzoate is not a neonicotinoid insecticide. So choosing to use chemicals within your yard is a personal choice, and I encourage you to weigh your options based on your views and what you want your yard to look like long term. I also believe there is a lot of pushback surrounding ash tree preservation that may stem from misinformation, or could well apply to treatments of imidacloprid or dinotephrine, which have the potential for greater harm to pollinators, for example, but which are also available for the general public to purchase and for cheaper. So that's first up.
So Emma, can I ask you a question on that? You mentioned that there's misinformation around things. What do you mean by that?
I think it's just a lack of complete information about injectable emamectin benzoate and how it may work, and the where it might go to. So whereas if you have a chemical that you're spraying all over the tree or you're pouring on the soil, there's a lot more potential for that to harm other beings. If you're injecting it into the tree and following best management practices, there's a relatively low risk of that chemical extending in the same way to other organisms.
But will it?
But it's all a balance, and it has to do with with what you want to preserve.
Yeah, absolutely. And so will it, just to be very clear with everybody, will it still kill like leafcutter bees or things that are using the leaves, or caterpillars or things that are feeding on the tree? It will still kill those, correct?
If it's injected there, it is very unlikely that it may extend to those organisms. There are a few studies out there that show a very small amount may be transmitted into the flowers of ash, but ash flowers for an incredibly limited time in the early spring. And so when I mentioned following best management practices, one of those practices is to wait to apply the chemical until after the tree has flowered.
Okay, awesome. That's really good to know. Perfect. Sorry, you can continue. Thanks for letting me interrupt.
For sure, no problem. So that's kind of a first option for residents. And then if you don't have the budget for treating your tree, you may need to start saving up now so that you have enough budgeted for a tree removal when your ash does eventually die. And depending on where you're located, maybe it's dead already, maybe it will die in 5 years, perhaps in 10 years. But if you don't protect it, it will eventually succumb to EAB. And tree removal will be costly, especially if your tree is large. So, if you plan to remove your tree and you have the capacity, one thing you could do now is you could underplant a little shade-tolerant buddy tree under or near your ash tree to give future canopy a head start. This will also help you to maintain some degree of continuous tree cover if for when you eventually have your mature ash removed. And there's some native trees that'll do really well under the shade of an ash tree, such as serviceberry or blue beech, witch hazel, pagoda dogwood, or ironwood, among others. So there's great options out there.
Right.
And then if you are looking to have a large ash tree removed, I recommend that you hire an ISA certified arborist. Tree work should be done only by those who are trained and equipped to work safely in trees, and removing trees, especially large trees, can be dangerous work. To add to that, EAB-killed ash can add an extra layer of risk because these trees can become brittle really quickly, and they may respond to removal in a less predictable way than a typical tree would. So, you can use the Find an Arborist page, which we'll link to. It's on treesaregood.org to locate a certified arborist near you.
Awesome. That sounds great. So what kind of budget do you think people should be looking at, either for treatment of an existing tree or removal of dead trees?
So the treatment is going to vary based on the size of your tree, so will the removal cost, but it's based on the diameter inch. So if you get someone out to give you an estimate, they're going to give you that estimate based on the size of your tree and the diameter inch. So if you have an average tree, you're probably looking at maybe around $150, maybe $200 to treat your tree. As I mentioned, that could be every 2 to 3 years. I would say 3 years if your tree is in otherwise good health. So it can help you stretch that budget over the long term, right? Because budgets are obviously another factor for folks in addition to the value that their tree might bring to them. Whereas removal is quite a bit more than that, especially if you wait until the tree dies. If it's a large tree, it's going to be quite costly. And I'm not willing to put an estimate on that other than it can be quite costly because there's a lot of factors. Are you close to utility lines? Is it leaning over your house? Do you have other trees that were things that need to be worked around? So that's all going to be factored into the budget. And if you have an arborist out to visit, they will take all those things into consideration when they're putting together an estimate for you.
Right, exactly. And I feel comfortable in saying that, just making sure everyone knows that it's tree removal of large trees is in the thousands of dollars. And so it needs to be thoughtfully, needs to be thought ahead of time as to how it's going to happen, because the vast majority of the ash trees in especially the southern half of Minnesota will die in the near future. Is really broad brush to paint, obviously, with that, but people need to be prepared for it. So as people are looking to see what's going on, can we cover as to how to identify an ash tree? Is that something that you could help us out with to make sure people know what they're looking at?
Yeah, for sure. So, first of all, if you don't know if you have an ash or not, you can look up ash online. I'm just going to say, if you're a visual person like me, that having me provide ID tips for anything through your earbuds might not be super helpful. So, I haven't seen the internet steer me wrong when I look up information on ash and emerald ash borer. There's a lot of good information out there. So you can look up ash bark. Sometimes it's a little variable, but you can look up green ash to learn about the characteristics. It's got netted bark is what I would describe it as. And you're seeing the leaves are in groups, so it's leaflets on the leaf. But again, if you're not visual, look it up to see what it looks like, and it'll make a lot more sense to you. So you have an ash tree. Do you have emerald ash borer? Again, I would recommend you look up these tips online. There are a lot of good resources, and chances are you'll find something useful. But for a tree in an early stage of infestation, to give you some idea, the leaves on the top of the tree begin to thin out and they start to die. And as the tree is growing increasingly stressed, it might send out additional shoots and leaves from the trunk closer to the ground. This is called epicormic sprouting or branching. And then as this moves along, eventually woodpeckers are going to be drawn to those trees due to the growing presence of insects. And the way that they extract the insects from under the bark leads to patches of missing bark and a general appearance of what we call blonding on the trunk, so that the trunk of the tree starts to look a little more uniform and it looks blondish in color instead of the regular brown color that it normally has. And so originally, early on in infestation, early 2009, 2010, we talked a lot about the D-shaped exit holes from the adult beetles leaving the tree, or insect galleries and larvae under the bark. And those things may all be present, but for a regular person out there looking, these things are often higher up above eye level, so they're really difficult to observe. Unless you've got a special pair of binoculars, you're out there looking and you know what to look for. So I would say look for examples of this epicormic branching or sprouting and the blonding of ash. You can check this out online, look those things up, and you can get a feel for what I'm describing here. Now, if you're in the Twin Cities metro, chances are this is already occurring and very close nearby.
Right. And we will, just so everybody knows, we'll put photos and links and everything in the show notes for this episode, so people can go to minnesotagardening.com and just search for EAB, and they will absolutely find it there for emerald ash borer. So as we have trees that are being infested, what actually does emerald ash borer do to the tree that kills it?
It will girdle it. So the beetles are living inside under the bark, and the way they create their galleries, spreading out over time, they will keep the nutrients from moving around on the tree so that it is not able to get its nutrients and it will die. And that can happen really quick, as I mentioned, in these areas where we have huge components of ash. The population of the borer beetles can increase very, very quickly. So you can get really large numbers of beetles very soon.
Yeah, again, I am just shocked at how extensive the spread has been this year. I also I was in Rosemount visiting a client there, and it was incredible, just the number of dead ash trees everywhere when it wasn't the same as it has been in the last couple of years. So it's just a really big problem that people are seeing now.
Yeah, we've kind of within this circle, we may feel like everybody already knows about it, but it's not the case, right? People are just starting to notice it in a lot of areas. In like the first ring of suburbs outside of St. Paul last year, for example, is when I began to notice a lot of standing dead, a lot of hazardous trees. So it is very quickly able to become a very serious concern.
So how does emerald ash borer spread?
It's able to fly in very small amounts. So It may travel, about a mile per year, so that's how we're seeing it move around the metro. However, also, it moves around in wood if people cut down trees and are moving it around. A lot of the initial push when emerald ash borer arrived in the state was to keep people from moving their firewood up to their cabins up north. And so there was a lot of advertising and messaging around that. And I think that they did a really, really great job at helping to slow down the spread of it, because it has moved here in Minnesota quite a bit slower than in other parts of the country. Couple that with us having way more ash than a lot of other states, and you have a potential recipe for disaster. We're on track for the disaster, and it's happening in places, but I think that we're doing a great job of what we can to help manage it and spread those costs out over time.
Yeah, exactly. So that piece, I went last spring to Whitewater State Park in southeast Minnesota, and they had gotten an emerald ash borer infestation there at the Whitewater State Park presumably from firewood coming in, because it wasn't anywhere else around that state park at the time. So they pulled all the ash trees down, and so they are now replacing with everything. And so it's a big deal that people need to be aware of. So good. So what are best practices, that, if we haven't talked about it yet, for slowing down that spread of emerald ash borer?
Yeah, so I mentioned there's been a pretty successful push to slow the spread. And by slowing the spread, we're able to spread the costs of that management out over a greater number of years, which can be really beneficial for cities, for example, that have limited resources, especially if 40 or 50% of their public trees are ash. So some communities have chosen to remove and replace all their ash trees. Others are choosing to treat healthy, valuable trees to keep them on the landscape and maintain those benefits. And they're instead focusing their removals on unhealthy, smaller ash. One thing that we can provide for listeners, the Minnesota Department of Agriculture has a great guide out there called Guidelines to Slow the Growth and Spread of Emerald Ash Borer that we can link to for detailed best practices.
Okay.
And what I would say is important to note here is that the best strategies depend on the level of EAB infestation that's present. So they're not going to look uniform across Minnesota. And I would also note that guidance focuses on landscaped areas, so I think this is well in line with your listeners, because the potential benefits from this EA management and these tactics in communities and other residential areas are much greater than in forested areas. So a few BMPs, for example, in areas that are not known to be infested yet, it doesn't really make budgetary sense for you to be treating trees because it's not there yet. I wouldn't waste your money. It may not yet be an appropriate time to remove trees either. It's very preemptive, and if you're able to budget for it in the future, I don't see the need to remove your trees yet. On the flip side, in heavily infested areas, you are running out of time to begin planning or starting to inventory what you have if you have a larger piece of land or if you're a municipality, for example. Monitoring and treatment are not likely going to be an effective use of your time once areas are heavily infested. And then in general, when EAB arrives in your area, monitoring or surveillance, treatments, or removals and replanting are all appropriate measures to be taken.
So where you said, was it 40 counties that emerald ash borer has spread through Minnesota?
Yes, correct. And I can link to a map as well so that folks can see where there's infestations, a large swath of the state that's considered generally infested, and then those couple outliers as well.
Got it. Perfect. Yeah, and it's generally, if I recall correctly, the southern half, southeast portion of Minnesota. So we'll see how that continues to grow and change over the coming years. So
Yeah, for a couple years we didn't find too much, and that was during COVID times. And so I think that there just weren't the resources out there at that point in time to be detecting. And so following that, the Department of Ag ramped up their surveying efforts, in part due to some funding received through the Environmental and Natural Resources Trust Fund. Mm-hmm. And as a result, they have found a great number of additional infestations. So That is how Fargo was recently detected, and additional areas have been found in the past months.
Got it. Yeah, anecdotally, I feel like the map is a lagging indicator of where things are.
Definitely.
And
they
where
can't be everywhere. It's just a few people out there. So they do rely on people to report. So, if you have a suspicious tree that you would like to report, we can also put the link for where you can report that tree if you're in an area without a known infestation.
Yeah, that was actually my next question is what do people do? Is it best to just email in if someone's concerned about things, or is there a website that people should go to and fill out a form, or what's the best way of handling that?
Yeah, we'll put a link in there so that you can click right through and figure out how you can submit that.
Beautiful. That is perfect. All right. Well, Emma Schultz, thank you so much for being here and taking your time to help educate people on emerald ash borer and just what's going on and how really devastating this is, and what there will be a massive change in tree canopy, especially in urban and suburban areas over the course of the next 3 to 5 years. And it's already started significantly in some areas. So is there anything about emerald ash borer that I haven't asked you about yet that you'd like to make sure people know?
No, I don't think so. I hope that a positive can come of a negative. So as I mentioned, our efforts to diversify our trees going forward, I really hope that this will help communities, help residents in the future to avoid these massive budgetary constraints that people are facing today.
Exactly. Absolutely. And so along those same lines, just to want to hit, there are a couple of trees that have been planted very heavily as well in the maple world. So I would recommend people plant.
Maple world, yeah, that's kind of the next front is I can't recommend that you plant a maple. I know it's beautiful, but there's other options that provide, beautiful fall color as well. So I mentioned blue beech as one option for you to plant underneath an ash tree. It's not a large shade tree, but it does provide some pretty fall color. We could also put a list of trees you might consider planting instead of maples if you're interested in some visual interest in your yard.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be wonderful. Is there anything else in that category of like maples that are being overplanted and potentially problematic into the future? And if you don't know, that's totally fine as well. But is there anything else that's in that category that people should avoid?
Oh, well, there's nothing that's quite planted at that extreme level, so we're not seeing any population numbers that are quite as high as maple. I would say one thing that, depending on where you are, you may not make your first pick to be non-native spruce trees. Our climate is not super well adapted for where some of the trees, like a Colorado blue spruce, may have originally been from, and so the increased moisture often contributes to a lot of health problems that these trees are facing. And if you are spending, a good chunk of money to put a tree into your yard that you want to value long term, you should really set yourself up for success, right? So avoiding some species like spruce that might have health issues. And so we recommend sticking a little closer to home than Colorado blue spruce. I would recommend
for sure
something that we know can do well here.
Right. Exactly. Awesome. Well, Emma, thank you so much. This has been perfect for our listeners to understand what's going on with emerald ash borer. And if they have questions or want to talk and learn more, we'll put links in the show notes for the episode so that people can find out more about emerald ash borer and go from there. So thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too.
See what I mean? Emma was just awesome to talk with, and she has such an incredible amount of knowledge on emerald ash borer and urban forestry in general. So it was great to have her here on the podcast. And you can head over to minnesotagardening.com. minnesotagardening.com and check out the show notes for this episode. Just search for EAB or emerald ash borer and it will come up right on the first one. Look at the show notes and different things we talked about and make sure that you are as up to date as possible on emerald ash borer. And if you could please share this with your friends. I know it's not a super fun, exciting, uplifting topic or anything like that, but this is critical information that people need to know about. And as you go through your neighborhoods and you see things that are happening, just neighborhoods are being devastated by this insect and the trees. We need to make sure that we're handling this correctly and planting back a diversity of trees and making sure we're not putting more maples in and that kind of thing. So just make sure to share this with your network if you could, please. And also, if you enjoy and appreciate what we're doing here at Minnesota Gardening, please make sure to consider being a part of the Minnesota Gardening Club. It supports us and helps get this work done at $10 a month, and we would love to have you there. There's a significantly higher level of community and direct personal contact with me. I'll answer your questions, things that you want in landscaping, questions you have about gardening and sustainable lawn care and landscape, as well as weekly tips as to what you need to be doing each week in your garden to help you stay on top of things, and a lot more content. So if you would appreciate having you there. Would love getting to know you at minnesotagardeningclub.com. Thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day. Appreciate you.